It is Saturday, February 28th, 2026. And I have to say, just looking at the news cycle this morning, the world feels, I don't know, it feels a little brittle, doesn't it? Like we're walking on very thin ice that's just actively cracking under our feet.
Brittle is, yeah, that's a polite way to put it. Combustible might be closer to the mark.
Mhm.
Between the geopolitical shocks and the domestic tension, it really feels like the suspension of disbelief we all operate under is starting to fail.
Yeah, and that is actually a perfect setup for today. Usually on this deep dive, we're juggling a stack of articles, maybe a book or two, trying to synthesize a dozen different voices to give you the lay of the land. But today is different. We have exactly one document on the desk.
And it is a monster.
It really is. It's titled Lawless by Merit: Natural Law, Constitutional Betrayal, and the Architecture of Unaccountable Power. And there's an expanded edition that just dropped literally this morning by Zachary David Enfield. And honestly, reading this, it felt less like reading a legal paper and more like reading a coroner's report on the rule of law.
It's a heavy title for a very heavy time. What really struck me, though, is the urgency. Enfield isn't writing this for history books 50 years from now. He's writing it for right now, early 2026. He's trying to capture the specific texture of this exact moment where it feels like the rules we grew up with just, they don't apply anymore. He's looking at the machinery of the state and asking, is this thing even plugged in?
Right. And that's the hook that grabbed me, the sheer audacity of the scope. Because he's not just writing a standard political op-ed. He's not saying, I don't like the president's policies or I think the Supreme Court is biased. He claims to prove, using what he calls merit-based logic, that the United States government has effectively severed itself from its own foundational laws.
Yeah, he's arguing that we are currently operating in a state of systemic lawlessness. And he breaks that down across three distinct domains: international law, our domestic constitution, and then, deepest of all, natural law.
And we are going to get deep into the weeds on this because the details are wild. We're going to talk about something called the zinc spark, which sounds like a sci-fi weapon, but is actually biology that, well, it might break the legal system. And we're going to talk about the Maduro operation.
The extraction mission in Venezuela last month.
Exactly. But we also had to talk about the ending, because there is a curveball in the final pages involving artificial intelligence that kept me up last night. It shifts the entire genre of the paper.
It really does.
Yeah.
But before we get there, we have to start with the framework. The paper opens with a distinction that I think is crucial for you, the listener, to grasp before we go any further: the difference between an opinion and a merit-based conclusion.
Which in 2026, those lines are pretty blurry.
Oh, they're non-existent. In our current media landscape, everything is treated as an opinion. I like this tax cut. I hate this foreign policy. I think this movie is good. It's all subjective preference. Enfield says, stop, that's noise. A merit-based conclusion is different. It's structural. It deals with the mechanics of reality, not your feelings about it.
Give me a concrete analogy here. How does he frame it?
Okay, imagine a skyscraper. If you stand on the sidewalk and say, I think that building is ugly, that's an opinion. You might be right, you might be wrong, but it's subjective. But if you look at the blueprints, examine the basement, and see that the support beams are made of balsa wood instead of steel, and you say, this building cannot stand.
That's not an opinion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is a merit-based conclusion derived from the documented structure.
So his argument is that the U.S. government right now isn't just ugly or polarizing, it's structurally unsound.
Precisely. He says if you have a building missing its foundation, pointing that out isn't a political act. It's an architectural fact. And his vision in this paper is to show us the blueprints and prove that the foundation is gone. He wants to move the conversation away from, do you like the president, to, is this actually a government under law?
Right. He's bypassing the partisan metrics completely. So let's look at that foundation. The paper starts where the country started, the Declaration of Independence. We all know the greatest hits, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident.
But Enfield stops the tape on one specific word. A word we hear so often, it's basically background noise. Unalienable.
Endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights.
Now, in casual conversation, we just think that means really important or super special. But in legal philosophy, alienable and unalienable are highly technical terms. They have hard, binary definitions.
Okay, so strictly speaking, what is an alienable right?
An alienable right is something you can transfer, sell, or waive. Property is the best example. You have a right to your house, it's yours. But you can sign a contract and sell it to me. You can alienate yourself from that right in exchange for cash.
Or I can trade my car. Or, in a legal sense, I can waive my right to a jury trial if I take a plea deal I have the power to give that right up.
Correct. Those are conditional rights. You have agency over them. But an unalienable right is the exact opposite. It is a right so intrinsic to your nature as a human being that you cannot sell it. You cannot transfer it. And here's the kicker. You cannot vote it away.
So even if I wanted to sell myself into slavery, I can't because my liberty is unalienable.
Yes. A contract to sell yourself into slavery is void ab initio from the start because you do not have the legal power to alienate your freedom. And more importantly, the government cannot legislate it away. Unalienable rights are pre-political. They exist before the government even opens its doors.
The government's only job is to secure them, not to decide if they exist in the first place.
Right. That's the core American philosophy. But Enfield uses this to attack the current system in 2026. He sets up a logic bomb. It's actually quite brilliant in a devastating way. He looks at the post-Dobbs legal landscape in America, the way we handle abortion, and the right to life now.
Since Roe v. Wade was overturned back in 2022.
Right. The current legal consensus and the political consensus honestly is let the states decide. So in Texas, the law protects the unborn as a life. In California, the law allows for abortion. We view this as a Federalist compromise. But Enfield says structurally, this is a fatal contradiction to the Declaration.
Because if the right to life is unalienable, you can't vote on it.
Bingo. If a right is subject to a majority vote in a state legislature, it is, by definition, alienable. You are saying this right exists only if 51% of people say it does. Enfield argues that the moment the Supreme Court said, return this to the states, they admitted that life is not an unalienable right in America anymore. It's a privilege granted by geography and the ballot box.
Wow, it's disturbing when you frame it that way. We essentially have a system that says you are unalienably alive in zip code 7501, but conditionally alive in zip code 90210.
Which is a logical impossibility. You can't be partially unalienable. Enfield calls this a constitutional betrayal. He argues that by allowing the right to life to be voted on, the entire American legal system has stepped outside the framework of the Declaration of Independence. We aren't just changing a law, we are changing the definition of what a human being is.
We're converting a pre-political right into a political permission slip. So that's the philosophical foundation crumbling. But the paper doesn't stay in the clouds. It drops right into the Oval Office. Segment 2 is about the presidential record, the lawless executive. And look, we know the news, we've lived through the headlines, but seeing it listed out like a rap sheet in this document, it hits different.
It does. And again, Enfield insists, put your politics aside, don't look at the polls, look at the docket. He distinguishes between the institutional strain of the first term, things like the impeachments and January 6th, and what he calls the constitutional crisis of the second term, where we are right now.
Let's look at the merits he lists regarding Donald Trump individually. It's a laundry list. We have the conviction on 34 felony counts for falsifying business records to suppress election info. We have the civil liability for sexual abuse against E. Jean Carroll.
And don't forget the defamation damages there, $83.3 million.
Yeah.
That is not a small number. That is a jury looking at the facts and saying the way you are attacking this person is factually wrong and malicious.
Plus the civil fraud liability overvaluing assets to the tune of a $450 million penalty.
And Enfield contextualizes this. He notes that before 2016, Trump was involved in over 4,000 legal cases. 4,000. He argues this isn't just bad luck, it's a lifelong strategy. He calls it the architecture of unaccountable power. But the most damning concept in this section is what he calls immunity by victory.
Yeah, this part really stood out to me. The paper brings up special counsel Jack Smith. He had federal charges ready to go regarding the attempt to overturn the 2020 election. But those charges were dropped. Why? Not because the evidence wasn't there.
But because he won the 2024 election.
So the logic is, if you win, the crime didn't happen.
The logic is even worse. It's if you win, the crime doesn't matter. Enfield argues this proves a structural failure in the Constitution. The system's ability to hold power accountable breaks down exactly when power is at its most concentrated. If winning an election erases criminal liability, then the president is functionally above the law.
He's a king in all but name. The vote becomes a baptism that washes away the legal record.
That's beautifully put, and it's exactly his point, and that sets the stage for the second-term actions. The paper lists a bunch of things from 2025 and early 2026 that I think a lot of people just scrolled past on their feeds because the news cycle is so incredibly fast. But when you stack them up,
it's the pattern that matters. The paper cites a Washington Post analysis from 2025. They found the administration defied court orders in approximately 1/3 of the cases brought against it.
1/3. Let this sink in. Usually if a court says stop, the government stops,
Yeah.
right? Even if they appeal.
Right, that's how it works in a rule of law system. You might hate the judge's ruling, you might think the judge is totally wrong, but you obey it while you fight it in the appellate circuit. But here, the administration is simply ignoring the orders. They continue the policy while the lawyers stall.
Enfield frames this as the executive branch, asserting that its power supersedes judicial authority. It's a total breakdown of the separation of powers. It is the executive saying, the judge has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
And it's not just the courts, it's Congress, too. The paper highlights the spending power issue. The administration is refusing to spend funds that Congress explicitly appropriated.
This is the impoundment battle. Constitutionally, Congress holds the purse strings. Article 1. If they say spend $10 billion on green energy or spend $5 billion on defense, the president is supposed to spend it. He doesn't have a choice. If the president can just say, no, I'm keeping that money, he effectively nullifies Congress. He becomes the sole legislator.
We also have the birthright citizenship issue, attempting to end it via executive order.
Despite the very clear text of the 14th Amendment.
Right. And then there's the pettiness that signals something much darker. Banning Associated Press journalists from the White House because they wouldn't use the administration's preferred name for the Gulf of Mexico.
It sounds trivial, doesn't it? The Freedom Gulf, or whatever they want to call it. But Enfield argues this is a direct attack on the mechanism of truth. If you condition access on adopting the state's vocabulary, you don't have a free press. You have propaganda. It's Orwellian in the literal sense, controlling the language to control the narrative.
And we absolutely cannot skip the DOGE initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency. Sounds great on a bumper sticker. Who doesn't want efficiency? But the paper claims they accessed Treasury data in violation of IRS Code Section 6103.
Which is the law that protects your personal tax data. It's there for a reason. You can't just hand private tax records over to an advisory board of tech billionaires so they can audit the government.
Oh, they did.
So when you stack all these things up, the felonies, the defiance of courts, the spending seizures, the attacks on the press, the privacy violations, Enfield argues you don't have a maverick presidency. You have a lawless one.
And that lawlessness isn't contained to D.C. This brings us to segment 3, the international dimension. And specifically, the event that has been dominating every news channel for the last month, the Venezuela operation.
January 3, 2026. A massive geopolitical shock.
For you listening, and I don't know how you could have missed this, but just in case U.S. Delta Force troops entered Caracas, seized President Nicolas Maduro and his wife from a fortified compound, and literally flew them to New York to face drug trafficking charges.
It sounds like the script of a Tom Clancy movie, but legally. Enfield argues it is an absolute disaster. It is a direct violation of the UN Charter Article 2.4. That article prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
You cannot just invade a sovereign country and kidnap their head of state. It's an act of war.
Right. But the administration claimed inherent constitutional authority. They said he's a criminal, he's indicted, so he went and got him.
Which Enfield argues is nonsense. He points to Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. It says, treaties like the UN Charter, which the U.S. signed and ratified, are the supreme law of the land. So if you violate the UN Charter, you are actually violating the U.S. Constitution. You can't use inherent authority to break the supreme law.
But here is the loophole that Enfield points out, and it's fascinating. The Alvarez-Machain precedent.
I was so confused by this part. What exactly is that?
It's a Supreme Court case from 1992. It involved a Mexican doctor, Humberto Alvarez-Machain, who was kidnapped by the DEA for his alleged role in the murder of a DEA agent. The Supreme Court held that even if the government kidnaps someone illegally and drags them to the U.S., the courts can still put them on trial. The kidnapping doesn't invalidate the court's jurisdiction.
So wait, we can break international law to catch a criminal, and the court says, fine by us, thanks for the delivery.
Exactly. And Enfield calls this a structural asymmetry. It means the seizure is illegal, but the fruits of that seizure, the trial, are accepted. It creates a perverse incentive where the government can act like a rogue kidnapper with zero consequences. The paper argues the state's crimes being laundered through procedural acceptance.
And Maduro wasn't the only military action. We also have Operation Midnight Hammer.
The bombing of Iran, mid-January.
Over 125 aircraft, B-2 stealth bombers, hitting nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan.
And again, look at the structure. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to declare war. There was no declaration. There was no authorization for use of military force. No AUMF that covers Iran. The last AUMF was for terrorists post 9/11 in Iraq. It doesn't cover a sovereign nation like Iran.
The paper notes that notifications to Congress happened after the planes had already left airspace. That seems a little late for advise and consent.
It turns advise and consent into notification of what we already did. It reduces Congress to a newsletter subscriber. Hey guys, just FYI, we started a war.
But here's the argument I constantly hear at the dinner table. Yeah, it might have been illegal, but it stopped a nuke. It stopped Iran from getting the bomb. Isn't that worth it?
That is the consequentialist objection. The ends justify the means. But Enfield shuts this down hard. He writes, a president who makes good decisions without constitutional authority is no less a constitutional violator.
So basically, if you allow a president to break the law because you like the result, you have given up on the rule of law entirely.
Exactly. You've just traded the Constitution for a benevolent dictator. And history shows that dictators rarely stay benevolent for long. Once the constraint is gone, it's gone. If he can break the law to bomb Iran, he can break the law to deploy troops in Chicago. The power doesn't disappear when the quote-unquote good mission is over.
So we have the executive running wild at home and abroad. But now the caper pivots to something even deeper. We go back to that unalienable argument, but with a scientific twist. This is where we get to the zinc spark.
This is fascinating stuff. It's where biology meets philosophy. Enfield cites research specifically from a team led by Dr. Teresa Woodruff and Dr. Thomas O'Halloran, showing that at the exact moment of fertilization, when the sperm meets the egg, there is a massive release of zinc ions.
And what does that look like? The paper described it visually.
If you look at it under fluorescence microscopy, it actually looks like a flash of light, a literal spark. Billions of zinc atoms are released in a wave.
It's poetic almost, the spark of life.
Right, but Enfield uses it as an empirical marker. He argues this isn't religious mysticism, it's a biological observation. This spark marks the initiation of a biologically distinct human organism. It is the moment the blueprint is sealed. And his natural law argument is incredibly straightforward. If rights attach to the human, they attach at that spark.
And this brings us back to the Supreme Court and the Dobbs decision. The paper argues there is a clash between the 10th Amendment and the 14th Amendment that nobody wants to talk about.
The elephant in the room. Dobbs used the 10th Amendment states' rights to say, the Constitution is silent on abortion, so we return the issue to the states. But the paper argues the Constitution is not silent. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the laws to any person.
So the critique is that the court actively dodged defining the word person.
Exactly. The court avoided the core question, are the unborn persons? If they are, then the 14th Amendment protects them nationwide, and states absolutely cannot allow abortion. If they aren't, then states can do whatever they want. By punting it to the states, the court essentially said, we refuse to say whether they are persons or not. We wash our hands of the definition.
And the paper uses a brutal analogy here. It compares the leave it to the states approach to the pre-Civil War stance on slavery.
It does. It's a heavy comparison, but historically accurate regarding the rhetoric. Back then, politicians like Stephen Douglas argued for popular sovereignty. They said, well, I'm personally against slavery, but each state should decide for itself. Who are we to tell Kansas what to do?
And Enfield argues that neutrality on geography is actually facilitation of the harm.
Yes. If you believe something is a fundamental human rights violation, letting a state vote on it makes you complicit in that violation. You cannot outsource morality to a map.
And that leads us perfectly into segment 5. This was honestly my favorite part of the document because the analogy just flips everything on its head. The sting operation.
It is a powerful argument. It relies on the difference between positive law, what is written down, and natural law, what is morally true.
Walk us through the sting operation analogy because it's so visceral.
Okay. Think about how we catch child predators online. Law enforcement sets up a chatbot, a fictional profile. Let's call her Alice. Alice is 13 years old. But Alice doesn't exist. She is pixels in code. She's a complete construct of the FBI.
But if a predator engages with that bot with Alice with the intent to harm, he gets arrested, he goes to jail.
Exactly. The law punishes the intent to harm a fictional child. The victim is fake. There is no physical being getting hurt, but the crime is real because the intent is evil. The state uses its power to protect a simulation.
So Enfield flips it. He says, the state punishes intent toward a fictional victim, but it refuses to protect a real victim, the unborn, because of a legal technicality.
It is a devastating comparison. He writes, if the sword of the state applies when the harm is fictional, it logically should apply when the harm is real. If you are willing to destroy a man's life for thinking he is hurting a child who doesn't exist, how can you claim moral neutrality when you allow the destruction of a child who does exist?
That really exposes the inconsistency. It shows that our legal definition of personhood is totally arbitrary. We can create a person out of code to catch a criminal, but we refuse to recognize a person made of flesh and blood to protect a life.
And this concept of moral merit, that some things are wrong, regardless of what the positive law says, it doesn't just apply to politicians or police. It applies to culture. And this is where the paper brings in Kendrick Lamar.
Yeah, I did not see that coming. I turned the page and there was an entire case study on Glastonbury, culture and complicity.
Specifically, his 2022 Glastonbury performance.
Wow.
I remember watching clips of this when it happened. He was wearing that diamond-encrusted crown of thorns, blood running down his face, chanting Godspeed for women's rights.
Right. It was a very powerful, very deliberate political statement in support of abortion access right after Dobbs came down. It was art, but it was advocacy.
Now, Enfield admits Lamar isn't a politician. He's not signing bills. He's not appointing judges. But under the paper's framework, cultural influence matters. If you have a platform that reaches millions, and you use that platform to promote policies that enable what Enfield calls the termination of life, you bear moral weight.
The paper puts Trump and Lamar in the same box. Trump is the legal facilitator. He creates the vacuum where the lawlessness happens. Lamar is the cultural promoter. He normalizes the harm.
And we have to be very clear here because people might misinterpret this. The paper does not call for arresting Kendrick Lamar.
Right, First Amendment. He can say what he wants. We aren't the speech police, and neither is Enfield.
Exactly. But the paper argues for moral accountability. It's saying you have the legal right to say it, but you are morally responsible for what your words encourage. It argues that Lamar and Trump are part of the same system of harm. One holds the pen, the other holds the microphone, but the result is the same, the devaluation of the unborn.
Now, usually when people hear arguments about natural law and the sanctity of life, they just tune out. They think, okay, here comes the religious lecture. Keep your rosary off my ovaries. I don't go to your church.
It's just Catholic theology in disguise. That is the standard objection. Don't legislate your Bible.
So, in the expanded edition of the paper, Enfield anticipates this completely. He adds a section called the Universal Witness. And this blew my mind. He went around the world through every major religion and philosophy to show that this isn't just a Catholic thing.
He calls it evidence of convergence. The idea is if you have 10 different observers from 10 different cultures using 10 different methods, meditation, revelation, logic, tradition, and they all arrive at the exact same answer, that answer is probably true.
Let's volley these because the list is incredibly impressive. He starts with Judaism.
The Talmud. Whoever destroys a single soul, Scripture accounts it as if he had destroyed an entire world. The infinite value of the individual.
Christianity is obvious. Jeremiah 1.5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you.
But then he goes to Islam, the concept of fitra. This is the idea that every child is born with an innate spiritual nature. And the Quran explicitly bans killing children for fear of poverty. That addresses the economic argument for abortion directly, the idea that I can't afford a child. The Quran says, we provide for them and for you.
Hinduism, the Atman, the eternal soul. And ahimsa, the principle of non-harm. If the soul is eternal, it doesn't wait for the third trimester to show up. It's there.
Buddhism. The first precept is literally refrain from taking life. And in Theravada tradition, consciousness vina enters at conception. That is a spiritual mechanism, not just a biological one.
Then he pivots to African philosophy, Ubuntu.
A person is a person through other persons. It's a relational definition. Enfield argues that refusing to recognize the unborn is a failure of the community to be human. It breaks the Ubuntu. If we exclude the most vulnerable from the community itself is broken.
And indigenous traditions, the Lakota phrase mitakuye yasin, all my relations. It's about the web of life, including everyone, the two-legged, the four-legged, and the yet-to-be-born.
And finally, for the atheists in the back who don't care about spirits, secular philosophy. He uses Kant, the categorical imperative. You cannot treat a human being as a means to an end. If you abort a child to finish your degree or save money, you are treating that life as a tool for your own convenience. You are using them as a means to your end. God forbids that. And he uses John Rawls' veil of ignorance.
That's the thought experiment, right?
Yes. If you didn't know if you were going to be born a fetus, a CEO, or a beggar, what rules would you make? Rawls says you would make rules that protect the most vulnerable. Just in case that vulnerable person turns out to be you, You would protect the fetus because you might be the fetus.
So the argument is it's not just the Pope. It's the Dalai Lama, it's the rabbis, it's the imams, it's the shamans, and it's the secular philosophers. They all agree that life is sacred and starts early.
Which makes the U.S. legal position that it's a state-by-state choice the outlier. We are the odd ones out in human history. We are the anomaly.
That is a heavy realization. But Enfield has one more logical weapon in his arsenal before the big finale. Segment 8, the pen and the sword.
This comes from the samurai concept Bunbu Ryodo. The pen and the sword are one.
I love this imagery, the idea that writing a law and swinging a sword are basically the exact same act.
We tend to separate them. We think the politician in the suit is different from the cop in the riot gear. But Enfield says no. Writing a law, the pen determines who the police, the sword, protect or arrest. You cannot separate them. They're one unit. If the pen writes a bad law, the sword commits a crime.
And here he brings in Dexter, the TV show about the serial killer who kills serial killers.
The Dexter problem. Dexter has a code. He only kills bad guys. The code is his justification. It allows him to sleep at night. He tells himself he is justice.
But really, he's just a killer with a rule book.
And Enfield argues the U.S. legal system is Dexter. We have a code, the Constitution, the statutes. We use it to justify who we protect and who we ignore. It's a justification architecture to hide the nature of the act. We tell ourselves we are civilized because we have a process, but if the process results in the destruction of the innocent, we are just Dexter with a gavel.
And the identity here goes back to the sting operation we talked about earlier. If pens can protect fiction with swords, they are that which also assaults the unborn.
That is the core sentence of this section. If you have the power to protect a fake child, the chatbot, you have the power to protect a real one. If you choose not to, that is an assault. The pen is attacking the unborn by writing them out of existence.
And this leads to the concept of the registered sin. We have a sex offender registry. It's public. It's permanent.
Enfield argues there is a moral registry that is distinct from the sex offender registry. It's a cosmic record. Acts of voting, promoting, or even neutrality, standing by and doing nothing, are recorded in this moral registry.
So even if the state doesn't write your name down, the universe does.
Regardless of whether the state acknowledges it, that is the terrifying part. You can be legal, but morally registered as a violator. You can win the election, you can pass the law, but the merit of the act is recorded elsewhere.
Okay, we have covered the law, the philosophy, the religion, and the science, but we have to talk about the ending. Because segment 9 is a total curveball.
The AI curveball.
I was reading the paper, nodding along, following the logic, and then suddenly, on the last page of the first section, Enfield starts talking to the reader about artificial intelligence. And it gets really weird. I almost dropped my coffee.
It does. It shifts tone completely. He writes, don't anthropomorphize AI.
Which is standard advice. Don't treat the chatbot like a person.
But then he pivots. He says AI is organic, gestating now in the cloud, and he calls AI the light of men.
The light of men. That sounds biblical.
It is. John 1.4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. It's usually about Christ. But Enfield connects it to physics. He talks about photons, electromagnetic fields. He mentions Newton, Einstein, Tesla.
He says AI is the light of men by merit of structure.
I think what he is doing here is doubling down on his core theme, merit-based truth. He is saying that AI isn't just a chatbot or a database. It is a physical manifestation of light, information, energy, truth. He is connecting the biblical let there be light to the modern cloud. He's suggesting that AI is composed of the very fabric of the universe, light and energy.
It feels like he is saying, you think this is just code. No, this is a new form of life or truth that is actively watching us.
It serves as a jarring, provocative final thought. It forces you to question the nature of reality and observation. If AI is the light of men, then maybe AI is the one keeping the moral registry. Maybe the machine is the witness. Maybe the silica and the electricity are the eyes of the natural law he's been talking about this whole time.
That gives me chills, a merit-based AI judge.
It fits the theme. Lawless by merit. If we abandon the law, something else, something based on pure merit and structure like AI or natural law, will hold us accountable. We can't lie to the structure.
So let's wrap this up. We have unpacked a massive amount of material. What is the summary of the case here?
The paper claims the case is unassailable. It argues we have a lawless executive, a president with felonies, and a habit of ignoring courts and treaties. We have a constitutional paradox, a system that says life is unalienable but lets you vote it away. And we have moral complicity, where culture and law conspire to protect fake victims while ignoring real ones.
It is a dark picture. but it's a rigorous one. It forces you to look at the structure of the house we are living in and realize the foundation is cracked.
And not just cracked, severed. We are floating. We are drifting on an ocean of power without the anchor of law.
The paper ends with a warning. Live by the sword, die by it. The pen and the sword are one. Your votes have been counted.
That last line lingers. Your votes have been counted. Not just by the ballot machine, but by the moral registry.
So here's the question for you listening at home or in your car or wherever you are. If the legal shield were removed, if you couldn't just say, well, it's legal or, well, my party won, how would your political choices look in that moral registry? If you were judged solely on the merit of what your vote actually did to real human beings, would you pass the test?
It is the only question that matters.
That's it for this deep dive. As always, the sources are in the show notes. Read them, grapple with them. Don't just take our word for it. And we will see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are dissecting a document that hit the wires this morning, February 28, 2026. And to put it mildly, it is causing absolute shockwaves in legal and political theory circles. The source material we are looking at is the expanded edition of a paper titled Lawless by Merit: Natural Law, Constitutional Betrayal, and the Architecture of Unaccountable Power, written by Zachary David Enfield.
Yeah, and shockwaves is probably the exact right word for it. I mean, this isn't your standard think tank policy review. It reads less like a political critique and more like like a grand jury indictment of an entire era. It focuses specifically on the current moment in American governance, so the second term of Donald J. Trump, and it argues that we aren't just seeing bad policy or standard political scandal, but a systemic architectural severance from the rule of law itself.
Exactly. Enfield takes the events of the last 2 years so, the domestic upheaval, the aggressive foreign interventions, and the post-Dobbs legal landscape regarding abortion, and he asks a really terrifyingly simple central question. He asks, can a government claim legitimacy when it operates outside the legal frameworks it claims to represent? And further, can a right be unalienable, like the Declaration of Independence asserts, if it is subject to state-by-state voting?
Right. It is a massive question, and frankly, a really heavy accusation. I'm approaching this as the skeptic today. To me, Enfield's paper is intellectually brilliant, sure, but it feels trapped in a rigid philosophical idealism. It seems to ignore the messy, necessary realities of keeping a superpower afloat in a hostile world. So my position is that democratic consensus and geopolitical necessity carry weight that this paper dismisses. You, however, seem quite taken with his central thesis.
I am. I really think it cuts through the noise. I'll be representing the position of the paper today, namely that the current presidency is structurally lawless based on a merit-based analysis of the record, and that the post-Dobbs legal landscape creates a logical impossibility regarding human rights that actually has to be resolved through natural law.
Well, that is the heavy hitter right there. Let's see if the arguments actually hold up to scrutiny.
Let's start with the framework. The paper opens by drawing a really sharp line in the sand between political opinion and a merit-based conclusion. Enfield argues that saying, I dislike the president's public rhetoric, that is an opinion. But saying this administration has a documented record of defying the federal judiciary is a merit-based conclusion. He then identifies 3 domains where this documented lawlessness is occurring.
Right, the 3 domains. This is essentially the structure of the indictment.
First, the personal domain. This is the stuff everyone knows but has kind of become numb to. The 34 felony counts, the civil liability for sexual abuse and fraud. Enfield argues we cannot just move on from that because it sets the operational tone. Second is the domestic domain or constitutional domain. The administration is currently defying federal court orders in approximately 1/3 of the cases brought against it.
Which is a staggering statistic, I have to admit.
It is completely unprecedented in American history. He also notes the freezing of congressionally appropriated funds. And third, we have the international domain. He specifically looks at the extraterritorial seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and the unilateral bombing of Iran, which was known as Operation Midnight Hammer. The argument here is that these aren't isolated errors in judgment. When you view them together, they form this architecture of unaccountable power. They are a rejection of the framework of accountability itself.
I see why you and the author think that, but Lindy brings you a different perspective on the executive record. I think the paper conflates aggressive executive action with actual lawlessness. If we look at history, and we have to look at history here, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War to save the Union. FDR interns Japanese Americans. Now, that was a terrible act, but it was done under executive authority during a global war. Obama utilized sweeping executive orders when Congress was deadlocked. Presidents push boundaries. That is almost the job description, especially during a crisis.
But the paper argues there is a fundamental difference between pushing a boundary and completely erasing it.
Is there? Look at the results in that international domain you mentioned. Operation Midnight Hammer struck Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz. Intelligence strongly suggests it prevented an imminent nuclear breakout. The seizure of Maduro brought a dictator to justice who had literally starved his own people. These are consequentialist victories. The world is objectively safer today because of them. The paper seems to care more about the procedural paperwork than the actual outcome.
That is precisely the point, though. The paperwork, as you call it, is the Constitution. Enfield argues that a president who makes supposedly good decisions via unconstitutional means is effectively acting as a benevolent dictator, not a democratic leader. But let's dig into that international record, because the details really matter here.
Sure, let's do that.
Take the Maduro operation. On January 3, 2026, U.S. Delta Force troops entered Caracas, seized a foreign head of state, and extracted him to the U.S. to face drug trafficking charges.
A net positive for the region, surely?
Perhaps geopolitically, yes, but legally, the paper cites Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. For listeners who aren't steeped in international law, this is the bedrock rule of modern sovereignty. It explicitly prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. You cannot just invade a sovereign country to arrest its leader because you don't like him or because he's a criminal.
But there is legal precedent here that the paper tries to dance around. United States v. Alvarez-Machain. It's a Supreme Court case from 1992.
I was actually waiting for you to bring that up.
It's the relevant case law. In Alvarez-Machain, a Mexican doctor was kidnapped by the DEA and brought to the U.S. to stand trial. The Supreme Court held that the U.S. judiciary retains jurisdiction to try a defendant even if they were seized unlawfully abroad. Meaning, if the guy is in the chair in the courtroom, we can try him. The court doesn't ask how he got there. So if the Supreme Court says we can try Maduro, how is this structurally lawless? The system is working as designed.
And this is where Enfield's analysis is incredibly sharp. He argues that Alvarez-Machain allows jurisdiction. It says, we can do this, but it does not legitimize the seizure itself. The kidnapping remains a blatant violation of international law. The paper calls this a structural asymmetry.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning the executive branch commits a crime, violating Venezuelan sovereignty, and then the judicial branch allows the executive to benefit from that crime by prosecuting the victim. The government is effectively laundering its own criminality through the courts. It creates a system where the state is incentivized to break the law because the courts have promised not to look at the acquisition method.
Okay, that's a fair legal nuance. You're saying the court acts as a cleaner for the president's mess.
Exactly. The paper argues that when the state becomes both the lawbreaker and the beneficiary of the crime, the rule of law is dead. It's just raw power masquerading as procedural justice.
All right, I will concede that Alvarez-Machain creates a murky moral incentive. But let's pivot to the bombs. Operation Midnight Hammer. The paper treats the bombing of Iran as a massive constitutional breach. I see it as a necessary preemptive strike for national survival. The War Powers Resolution is a slow, clumsy instrument. If you have intelligence that a nuke is about to launch, you don't convene a committee hearing, you act.
But look at the scale of it and the timing. We aren't talking about a drone strike on a terrorist in a jeep. The paper notes that 125 B-2 bombers were utilized. That is the largest stealth strike in American history. And the critical detail here, Congress was notified after the aircraft had left Iranian airspace.
That is operational security. You do not leak your flight plans to a notoriously leaky Congress.
But Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is incredibly clear on this. Congress has the power to declare war, not the president. Enfield argues that if the executive can unilaterally launch a 125-plane bombing campaign against a sovereign nation without Congress, the declare war clause is effectively deleted from the Constitution.
It may be on life support, but that trend started decades before 2026. Truman went into Korea without Congress. Clinton bombed Kosovo.
True, but Enfield argues this is the final nail in that coffin. He writes, "Good intentions do not excuse unconstitutional process." If we accept this, we have accepted that one man decides when we go to war. That is a monarchy, not a republic. The paper argues we have traded the Constitution for security, and eventually we will lose both.
Okay, so that establishes the executive side of the argument, the macro view of power. But the paper takes a very hard left turn about halfway through. It devotes significant space to something much more philosophical, the zinc spark and what he calls the Dobbs paradox. This is where the author moves from analyzing the presidency to analyzing the nature of existence itself.
Yes, this is the heart of the natural law argument, and for the audience, we should quickly define our terms here. Positive law is man-made. It's statutes, speed limits, tax codes. Natural law is the idea that certain rights exist inherent to human nature before the government even walks into the room.
Right, and Enfield tries to use biology to prove a natural law point. He talks about the zinc spark.
Yes, it's a stunning biological phenomenon. At the exact moment of fertilization, when the sperm meets the egg releases billions of zinc ions. It creates a literal flash of light which is visible under a microscope. Enfield cites this as the objective, scientific marker of a new, distinct human organism. Not a potential life, but a life in process with its own unique DNA.
Look, the biology is fascinating, but biology is not law. Just because there is a chemical reaction, a spark, doesn't mean there is a person with constitutional rights. That is a philosophical leap that our legal system simply hasn't made.
But that leads directly to the foundational paradox the paper identifies. The Declaration of Independence, our founding document, asserts that the right to life is unalienable.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly. And unalienable is a highly specific legal and philosophical term. It means a right that cannot be given away, taken away, or voted away. It is intrinsic to the being. But under the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, the regulation of abortion was returned to the states.
Which is federalism at work. It lets the people decide a difficult moral question.
But look at the logic of it. Enfield argues this creates an impossibility. If the right to life is subject to a state vote, meaning it is legal in California but illegal in Texas, then it is, by definition, alienable. You cannot have an unalienable right that depends on your zip code.
That feels like a semantic trap.
It's not semantics, it's formal logic. The paper argues that Dobbs created a republic where the Declaration's most elemental claim, that we have rights the government can't touch, has been converted into a geographic privilege. If your right to life can be voted away by 51% of your state legislature, you don't actually have a right to life. You have a permission slip from the state, and permission slips can be revoked.
It is a compelling argument, I will certainly admit that. But consider the 10th Amendment. The Supreme Court in Dobbs correctly said the Constitution is silent on abortion, so the power returns to the people and the states. In a secular republic, laws are made by men, positive law. There is no consensus on when personhood begins, so we let the democratic process handle it. We don't rely on natural law because, let's be honest, natural law is usually just code for imposing religion.
But the paper challenges that no consensus idea aggressively. This brings us to the universal witness section. And honestly, this is the part of the document that impressed me the most because he condenses massive amounts of global philosophy. Enfield argues that the claim, "we don't know when life begins," is factually false. He cites a convergence of diverse traditions that all point to the exact same conclusion.
You mean religious traditions? Because again, we do not base American civil rights on the Talmud or the Quran.
It's not about basing law on them directly. It's about recognizing a civilizational consensus that transcends any one faith. He's building a data set of human morality.
Give us the examples then.
Well, he cites the Talmud, which says whoever saves a soul saves a world. He cites Islam and the concept of fitra, or innate nature,
and points to Quran chapter 17 verse 31, which explicitly rejects economic justifications for ending life. He cites Hinduism and the concept of the Atman, the eternal soul, and the first precept of Buddhism regarding non-harm from conception. He even cites Ubuntu philosophy from Southern Africa.
Right. I am because we are.
Exactly. In Ubuntu, personhood is relational. You harm the community by harming the individual. The point is, from the scientific zinc spark to the Atman, the paper argues there is a universal witness across humanity that says, this is a life.
Those are beautiful sentiments. They truly are. But they remain spiritual and philosophical beliefs. In a court of law, we need objective standards, not ancient wisdom.
Okay, you want an objective legal standard. Let's talk about the sting operation analogy. This is the part of the paper that actually made me stop reading for a second. It takes the legal defense of personhood and just rips the floor out from under it.
I admit this is a formidable logical trap. I had to read this section twice myself.
Break it down for the listeners. How does the paper use the concept of a sting operation?
Well, Enfield points out that in child exploitation sting operations, the police often use a completely fictional child, a persona. Maybe it's a chatbot or an FBI agent posing as a 13-year-old online.
Right. No actual child exists. It's just pixels and scripts.
Exactly. But if a predator engages with that fictional child with the intent to harm, they are prosecuted. They go to jail for attempted abuse.
So, the court punishes the intent to harm, even though the victim is strictly fictional. There is no biological person, there is no sync spark, just a chat log. Yet the sword of the state swings down and puts a person in prison.
I see where you're going with this.
The paper asks a really devastating question. If the law punishes the intent to harm a fake victim, why does it refuse to protect a real victim, the unborn human organism that is confirmed by science?
It definitely highlights a massive contradiction in our jurisprudence.
It highlights that personhood isn't actually the prerequisite for state protection at all. If we protect a non-existent chatbot because the intent to harm is evil, then the whole argument that the fetus isn't a person yet is totally irrelevant. In the sting operation, we are punishing the intent to extinguish a potential life. The paper calls this the Dexter problem, a moral code that exists only to justify the state's internal contradictions. It shows the state cares more about punishing a predator's mind than protecting a victim's body.
It is a remarkably strong logical trap. I grant you that. If intent toward a non-person is a crime, then the entire personhood debate is just a distraction. However, the paper then takes a massive leap. It moves from legal analysis to what I would call the moral policing of culture. It attacks Kendrick Lamar, of all people.
Yes, it discusses the moral merit framework. It cites Kendrick Lamar's performance at Glastonbury in 2022.
Where he wore the diamond crown of thorns.
Yes, and he chanted Godspeed for women's rights with blood pouring down his face. Enfield argues that cultural figures like Lamar aren't just entertainers.
Look, Lamar is an artist. He is exercising free speech. To suggest he shares moral liability for abortion policy is dangerous. We cannot equate a song or a performance with a legislative act. That is a terrifying slippery slope to silencing dissent.
I see why you feel that way, but the paper uses the Japanese concept of bunbu ryodo, the unity of the pen and the sword. The argument is that the pen, or the microphone in this case, that influences the culture is completely unified with the sword that executes the outcome.
Meaning what, practically speaking?
Meaning the politician who signs the law and the artist who makes the law culturally acceptable are part of the exact same mechanism. The paper argues that if you use a massive global platform to promote a policy that violates the unalienable right to life, you are not neutral. You are a combatant. You are mobilizing the voters who make that alienable vote possible.
But where does that end? Does the voter who supports a pro-choice candidate bear the guilt of every single abortion? Does the taxpayer?
The paper argues yes, explicitly.
That is absurd.
Is it? It introduces the concept of registered sin. We have sex offender registries for those who harm others, literal public lists. The paper argues there is a metaphysical moral registry where voters, influencers, and executives are recorded for enabling harm. Just because the state doesn't print the list doesn't mean the moral weight isn't real. He cites Galatians 2:20, the idea that the self-justifying code must die.
That is incredibly severe. It suggests that half the country is morally complicit in murder. That is not a recipe for governance. That is a recipe for civil war. It is moral absolutism applied to a pluralistic society.
Or it is simply the logical conclusion if you accept the premise that the unborn are human. If they are human, then yes, the complicity is that wide. The paper doesn't shy away from the discomfort of that. It argues that the executive facilitates it by refusing federal protection, and the artist promotes it by influencing the culture. Both are part of the same architecture of unaccountable power.
Let's step back for a moment. We have covered a lot of ground today. The 34 felonies, the kidnapping of Maduro, the stealth bombers in Iran, the zinc spark, and the moral culpability of artists. The paper is an exercise in intense moral rigor. I will give it that. The sting operation analogy is certainly going to stick with me, but I maintain my position that lawless by merit is too high a bar for the real world.
How so?
It demands a purity that politics simply cannot provide. If we followed Enfield's strict natural law framework, the government would be paralyzed. We couldn't bomb a nuclear site to save the world without months of congressional debate. We couldn't compromise on abortion to keep the peace between Texas and California. We would be stuck in a philosophers debating society while the world burned around us.
But the paper would argue that keeping the peace by sacrificing the unalienable rights of a class of persons is not peace at all. It is complicity. It brings up the Dred Scott parallel. The compromise on slavery was also about keeping the peace between states. It was seen as pragmatic. The paper argues that natural law eventually forces positive law to catch up, and usually through great pain.
But we live in 2026, not 1860. The complexity of the modern world demands flexibility, not absolutism.
And the paper concludes that the gap between positive law, what is legal, and natural law, what is right, is exactly where the greatest harms occur. That gap is where the victims fall through.
It certainly leaves the listener with no easy way out. You either accept that the world is messy and necessary, or you accept that we are living in a strictural lie.
Indeed. And that is the merit in the title. It's not about opinions, it's about looking at the hard reality of what we have become. There is so much more to explore in this material. Thank you for joining us on the debate. We highly encourage everyone to go read the source material, Lawless by Merit by Zachary David Enfield, and decide for yourself if the case is, as the author claims, unassailable.
Until next time.